Today we are joined by the epic Ian Creswell. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Ian is one of our Mornington teachers. He's also a husband, a dad, also telling me off camera just before that he speaks the basics of 20 languages.
Yeah, very basic.
But fluent in 3 languages.
Correct.
Which ones?
English, Spanish and Afrikaans, and that last one's unfortunately a little useless because there's an ancient language that doesn't get spoken much. But anyway.
Fun facts.
Fun facts.
I love it. So tell us a little bit about your background. I know you have a fancy degree, but also in yoga and what you're passionate about with teaching yoga.
Yeah, so I guess the long and short of it is I've been teaching for about a decade. I'm very, very passionate about the body, everything that encompasses the body, physiology, anatomy, etc. Hence, I went on to study biomedical science and I specialized in it just is boring for a lot of people, but I love this stuff. I specialize in advanced exercise physiology and anatomy, and that just means I have lots of letters after my name and a really big HEX debt. Is it still called HEX? Is it still?
I don't know what it's called.
Whatever it's called. I've still got that.
You have it.
I have it. I can confirm that. It's on my ATO portal. Yeah. Anyway.
Good to know. And when you teach classes, of yoga classes, what I guess is your focus for students?
And it's interesting, I ask myself this all the time and I listen to what students tell me. I think where I've been known for is the more challenging classes, not only physiologically challenging, I'm non-negotiable with the breath as well. So I think I sort of maybe lean more towards the more challenging classes because I think that's where, for me anyway, I think in my opinion, that's where the transformation happens, on that edge of resistance. And I think I've sort of been pushing, which is a complete opposite because we're going to talk about injuries today. So there are literally opposing ends but there's a way we can challenge with safety, which we'll talk about in a bit.
Yeah, love that. Yeah, so today this episode is really about injuries, prevention of injuries, common injuries. So let's dive deep into that.
Let's get into it.
So what are the most common injuries that you see on the yoga mat?
Can I have a disclaimer at the top?
Totally.
I'm not a doctor. I'm not a physiotherapist. Everything I say is with a grain of salt. Please consult your medical professional before we get right into it. But what I do know is I think the body, and I've watched enough bodies to move over the years to sort of have my little 5 cents. Disclaimer over. Wrists. To answer your question, wrists. I would say the wrists are the most common. And I think if you sort of take them, I guess a drone level out, back to your question as to why injuries happen. And I think, and it's cliche and it's not, you've heard this a million times. I think number one reason why people injure themselves on the mat is they're not listening to their bodies. That little egoic self, which we all have, starts to take over, and that inner voice starts to really, I guess, separate you from listening to your body, all right? So I think most people push themselves way beyond the point that they should, which hence I teach a more embodied practice where it's non-negotiable. The first 5 minutes of all my classes is, you know what, I'm going to shut up and you listen to your body. Take note of where your body's at, where it's not at. A lot of we come to our practice, we've been sitting down in cars and at desks, and all of a sudden we ask these demands on our body in our practice, and you're going from one extreme to the other. And unfortunately, that's where injuries happen. And I wish I had a more entertaining answer, but it's really, really, really as simple as people not listening to their bodies. I think another reason is, and that's unfortunate about the industry, and I think it's getting better, but there's some underqualified teachers out there. I think it's a low barrier to entry, and I think the industry is getting a lot better. But over the years, I've been to a lot of classes, and fortunately not at Warrior One, but other classes where you definitely see some teachers cueing some things, and I'm like, I know I'm supposed to be in my body and practice. When I'm listening to the cues, I'm like, there's a lot in me that's like, okay, there's definitely some teachers out there with a lack of fundamental anatomy knowledge and safety. And there's no criticism against the individual, and a lot of them, they're just, have signed up for a 200-hour yoga course, and the anatomy teachers sometimes underqualified or don't have the credentials, and then they are advising people to do some pretty challenging things without a lack of fundamental understanding. So I think it's a mixture of, back to your question, it's a mixture of lack of listening to your body and maybe some underqualified teachers that are maybe a little bit out of depth.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this, you and I personally, but also we say this in our teacher training at Warrior One, but also to the teachers that we have on the teaching staff, is you always say to students, listen to your body first and the teacher second, right?
Absolutely.
It's fundamental, and that's exactly what you're saying, that, sometimes what's offered in a class is not potentially good for your body
Yeah.
at that point in time.
Absolutely.
And you have to respect that and not push. I know I've had little niggly injuries for the same reason. I'm like, I can do that.
Yeah.
And then I do it and I'm like, no, I cannot.
Yeah. And we can talk about pain in a little bit, but pain, it's a really bad indicator of what's actually happening internally. And what we know about pain now, what we've taught about pain is actually two different things. Pain's not linear. You don't have a 10 out of 10 pain and you have a severe bulging disc. You may have, a 2 out of 10 pain perception, but you have a severely bulging disc. So, and a great resource is Celeste Pereira. She's a yoga instructor and a physiotherapist who specializes in pain. And she talked a lot. It's not that linear. So people are like, oh, Ian, why aren't you teaching a headstand? I'm like, I don't know your neck anatomy, but I don't have any pain. I'm like, that's not a good indicator, That's just an example. But back to your question, I think wrists are the number one issue I see. And it's an overuse issue. I won't geek out too much on anatomy because people will just switch off. But your wrists are so bad at taking weight. Your ankles and your foot bones are evolutionary the joint that is meant to take weight, absorb weight, and transfer weight. Your wrists aren't. And we ask so much of our wrists in our practice. And that by far will lead to tendonitis and all sorts of wrist ailments. And it's inevitable if you do a lot of vigorous vinyasa, but that's definitely the biggest one.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And the worst thing about wrists is that they take so long to recover. I won't bore you with the physiology behind it, but you might as well break a bone. Bones will recover faster than a tendon or a ligament. They've just got no blood, very, very little blood flow. So people are like, oh, the wrist feels good. And then all of a sudden you see next time, oh, it's bad again. And it will just keep flaring up. And unfortunately, this comes back to your practice. If you're on your mat and you're doing that embodiment and you're doing that beautiful internal gaze, and you're like, oh, my wrist, maybe you need to skip a chaturanga. So it's that informed part of your practice at the start to really just listen. Maybe you don't have to do 10 chaturangas. It's still yoga if you don't do 10 chaturangas.
Yeah.
I don't teach chaturangas, but that'll be a different podcast altogether.
So what are some of the ways that we can manage or prevent wrist injuries?
Number one, they're frustrating. So I wouldn't say don't come to practice if you've got wrist issues. I think you can modify a lot. The number one thing I can tell you is if you feel like it's okay and you can bear weight on your wrists, if you're going from that chaturanga, so a high push-up to low push-up, use your knees. I would like to say I've got enough strength to do the opposite, but still to this day, I never, ever don't use my knees. Because I'm like, I don't need to go to Cirque du Soleil. Like, I'm not trying out for the circus. Like, I don't need the strength. Like, why am I not using my knees? So I still use my knees. So number one tip, use your knees for Pete's sake. Knees, chest, chin is what I've been practicing for a long, long time. And I think that is the best. But then he goes like, oh no, high push-up to low push-up. Looks great. Well, are you trying out for the Olympics? Probably not. So knees, chest, chin is a big one. And do you want me to give you a part of the body that no one actually talks about to help wrists?
Sure.
The core, right? If I'm going to throw numbers out at you, if you're in a high push-up position, just say it's 70% weight in your wrists, 30% weight in your feet. One way you can transfer the weight out of your wrists is engage your core. Nobody talks about that. So tight is light when you're on your wrists. So when you're upside down, whether it be a handstand or something as simple as, a high push-up position, engage the core, which is be another podcast altogether because that can mean multiple things. But essentially, if you're in a high push-up position, practice at home, put your belly button in up, low pelvic floor lifts. Those two actions together will transfer a lot of weight out your wrists. So I think no one talks about core engagement in wrist injury prevention, but it's a really, really important one. Yeah.
I love that tip. What about some other injuries? What about hamstrings? I know you want to talk about lower back.
Yeah.
Lower body.
Yeah, I would say, and then I want to make a distinguish between injuries that I see inside of a studio or an injury that's happened outside of the studio and they come into the studio with the injury. I'm pretty fortunate, touch wood, that I haven't had too many students actually injure themselves in the practice, but sometimes something can happen niggling and then later on they'll be like, oh. Hamstrings is a big one. It's particularly if you've done some injuries to your hamstrings, you've probably seen, or you've done it yourself, seen someone like really touch high in their butt. They're like, oh, and they make that quince. I don't know, right away, that's the insertion of the hamstrings. And normally that's, again, coming back to the original point, that's just overdoing it. When you're doing any hamstring opening, there's no need to lock your knees. Yes, there's people that are hypermobile that do have strength in the end range, but for the most part, why do you lock your knees? Your knee is a very vulnerable joint. You should always do a little bend in your knee. It's like, but there is a form of yoga that talks about locking your knees. And I do see from that, I won't mention which style of yoga is, but that particular style, there is a specific cue that sends shivers down my side, lock your knee, lock your knee, lock your knee. And I'm like, your knee should never be locked. That's a big one. You're getting into ligaments. We're not there to stretch ligaments. We're not there to stretch tendons. We're there to open bigger structures like fascia and connective tissue and muscles, obviously. As soon as you get into ligaments are not like muscles. They're not like elastic bands where once they stretch, they're stretched. And you need to work a lot. It's a long rehabilitation process. For these, again, like wrists, ligaments and tendons, they take a long, long time to recover. And if those of you done it. So again, the tip is there's no need to lock your knees ever, especially the halfway lift. So exhale, forward fold, inhale, halfway lift. A big tip for me, I always bring my hands to blocks, right? I always bring my hands to block and I take a heavy bend in my knees. So my halfway lift is almost look like an ironing board. Who irons anymore? But anyway, ironing board. Welcome to my ADD brain. Are you just getting into it? It's crazy. Well, but I'll always come back.
I am loving it.
But I'll always come back.
You do come back.
Yeah, I will, but I'll go right sometimes. So if you're just watching this, if you're not watching on YouTube, that's fine. But think about your halfway lift. Think like an ironing board with a heavy bend in your knees and shifting weight forward. As soon as you halfway lift, shift weight back, that's when you start to get into those insertion points and you're starting to get into the ligaments, which we don't want to get into. But again, 80-20 in rule, there's 20% of hypermobile people have a lot of strength in the end range. So they're the ex-gymnasts, the ex-ballerinas, and those people who have extreme, I would say, strength within the end range, which is not 99% of the people there.
Yes.
So I'm generalizing here, but just for the sake of conversation, I would say for most people, don't lock out your knees.
And what about tips for hamstrings?
The same tip. When it comes to the hamstring, you normally get injuries in the end extremities. Sometimes you'll get it in the belly of the muscle, but you won't feel it. So you get what they call like a 1st degree tear, 2nd degree tear, 3rd degree, 4th degree tear, sleep is a snap. You won't get that. Hopefully you don't get that. But what can happen over time, the belly can, what they call a micro tear. And over time, halfway lift, I can halfway lift my leg straight. Of course you can. But after 100 times, that micro tear can go from a 1st degree to a 2nd degree. And then obviously you're walking around like, hobbling around. I call them old man's injuries, when you just, which happens when you're 41. But anyway, but again, the same tip is bend your knees in any hamstring opening. There's no need to ever lock out your knees.
Got it. Lower back, that's a common one that I see.
Massive one. And that's normally, I find, as a consequence of what their lifestyle is off the mat. The saying I want to put on a t-shirt is sitting is the new smoking, right? I think sitting is literally...
Sitting is the new smoking. Oh, it's so true.
And I think as yogis, we're like so used to being that weird one who doesn't sit for more than 10 minutes. Like we're always moving our spines because there's that innate knowing that our bodies are meant to move. But for the vast majority of people who are sitting, unless you have an Apple Watch that ding, ding tells you to stand up, which is great.
I turn that feature off.
No, I need that in my life.
It's annoying.
That's where we're different. But yeah, so back to the point, lower back. So what happens when you're sitting? It doesn't rocket science, you're in this slouch position. So the spine's in this flex position. Furthermore, the science actually says that most Western bodies are in this position for 18 hours a day. 18 hours a day. So remember, you're sitting, sleeping in exactly the same position. And all of a sudden, we're teaching camel. Yay! We're teaching bridge, Dhanurasana. Sorry, I won't go Sanskrit because I'll mess it up. I'm not that great with Sanskrit, but names for things. But we're asked from this 18 hours a day to all of a sudden to take the extreme end of the back bend. So my tip is, especially at the start of class when you're warming up, 80%. You don't ever want to go to your end range too early because you're taking your spine from one extreme to the other pretty fast. And with the right teacher, the right sequencing, at the right cueing, they should be able to warm you up enough to a point where, you're not going to injure yourself. The majority of the back injuries, and I'm going to single out a particular demographic, is mothers with newborns or mothers who are carrying heavy weight. Fathers do it too, but fathers, believe it or not, genetically, this is weird. Fathers generally carry weight in front of them, but women carry weight on the side. I've actually studied that, why that happens. But anyway, a lot of women, and I'm generalizing here, but will carry a baby on the hip just because babies can be heavy, right? Especially you've got a whinging 2.5-year-old like I do that wants to be carried all the time. But what that actually happens, and I'll get a lot of women postpartum come to me going, Ian, my back's stuffed. I'm like, show me how you carry your baby. Boom. So what actually happens is there's a specific disc in between, and I won't bore you with it, but it's in between S1 and L5. So your L5 is the lumbar vertebrae. There's one particular disc there that gets jammed. So you're constantly doing that with weight. Then all of a sudden, their ego's like, I'm going to do wheel, right? So you've gone from this compression. Don't listen to my body. Before I had a baby, I could do wheel. I'm doing wheel. Be kind to yourself, because I can guarantee you, if you're with your body in the practice at the start, there's this internal dialogue. If you listen to it, you're like, okay, I can feel that I may need to maybe not do a wheel, right? Comes back to the same point. It's just listen to your body. And obviously, a lot of back injuries have a lot to do with lack of core, too, or and core, again, it's another podcast altogether, because I think we cue the core too much, personally. But there's a lack of core stability in a lot of our generation. Again, comes back to that seating, lack of core engagement. So again, it's another topic altogether, but without boring you too much, engaging a core in a back bend is actually beneficial. Do you want to tell you why?
Yes.
I was going to tell you, but I think this is interesting.
No, definitely.
So if that coaxial movement of the belly button in up low pelvic floor, what you're actually doing is creating an airbag. So your intestines, you can pretend you're interested, because this is not that interesting, is it?
I love talking about intestines.
True, I know. But your intestines can form an airbag against the base of your spine that protects it. So hence, back to your point, you can pretend you're interested, that's fine. That's fine. I know. Engaging core, belly button in up, low pelvic floor lift, that slight little engagement in a back bend. You won't go as deep, but I think that helps protect the back as well.
I love that tip, and I didn't think I would say the word intestines on this podcast.
You got to talk about it. I'm sure you'll talk about poo at some stage.
Actually, we have talked about poo. Yeah, no, we have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's necessary.
Yeah.
Well, in the West, we talk about what goes in the West, talk about what goes in the West, they talk about what comes out.
That's right.
Which is just as important. We digress. What are we talking about?
2 times.
It's second digression.
So we've worked up the body.
Cool.
And now we're thinking shoulders?
Shoulders.
Yes.
Such a vulnerable joint. Now, shoulder injuries can be quite common. Normally, shoulder injuries will happen outside, whether it be recurrent dislocations, whether it be through sporting injuries, but basically the shoulder is a terrible joint to bear weight. So if you think about your wrists, your shoulders, your entire upper limb, they're designed to manipulate your environment, right? They're designed to make your life easier. Your lower body is designed for weight bearing and getting you from point A to point B. So we ask too much of our upper bodies, our wrists and our shoulders in turn, right? So if you look at the shoulder anatomy itself, think about, the analogy I like to use is think about a golf tee and a basketball, right? That's how shallow and terrible the socket is. And there's not a lot of protection, especially in the front of the shoulder. There's not a lot of protection for the shoulder to dislocate. They're designed to swing from trees, right? They're not designed to take weight. So if you have a capsule that is prone to dislocations, you can dislocate your shoulder. And I'll be very specific where it will happen: 3-legged dog into a flip dog or 3-legged dog into a wild thing. That specific action is 2 arch enemies, which is weight bearing and gravity on the shoulder in a vulnerable position. It's a combination for disaster. So is it a bad? No, but if you have a vulnerable shoulder, I would suggest you skip it altogether, because you're putting, if you weigh 80 kilograms, or 84 like me, you are putting 84 kilograms. I was going to lie and say 80, but I'm not. I'm 84. Welcome, 41. You're putting your entire body weight on your shoulder, and you're literally rotating your entire body weight around your shoulder. So I would say if you have a vulnerable shoulder, skip it. Inhale, right leg lifts, and just hold a 3-legged dog. Don't take it. And if you are going to take it, move as slow as you can. So when you're flipping the dog, I tell people it's like you're moving through honey. And what you're doing anatomically, all the little stabilizing muscles are going like, oh, I'm safe. I'm going to activate and switch on. As opposed to inhale, right, lift, flip dog. And all of a sudden, all the stabilizing muscles are like, what did you just do? So if you're going to do it and you have good shoulder integrity, go slow or don't do it at all. It looks cool, looks fancy, looks like a fancy yoga move. But right leg, left, bend and peel, hold. Don't go any further. And that's it.
It's great advice.
Yeah, why do you have to flip your dog? Anyway, flip your...
Looks cool.
Yeah, it does look cool. It's fancy yoga, I call it.
Fancy yoga.
Fancy yoga.
What about strengthening the shoulders, right? Because that's important to support the joint, like you said, and also support the wrist.
Correct. So stability is really, really important. And I go back to a sutra. Can I talk about a sutra for a little bit? Because
Give a little bit of context for people that don't know what you're talking about.
When I'm looking at the body, there's multiple ways to look at it. I can look at it from a Western anatomical lens, which we've done a lot of, but I can look at it through the sutras. And the sutras, for those who don't know, are the ancient scriptures of yoga. And there's many commentaries on it. And there's only one commentary on asana, actually, that mentions asana. Out of the entire Patanjali Sutras, this text talk about asana once.
And asana is, for the people that don't know,
is interchangeable with the word yoga. So asana is one part of the yogic world, but most of the West think yoga is asana yoga. We use it interchangeably, but asana is the physical practice of yoga. And it talks about sthira sukha asana. And I won't sing it because you'll just laugh and switch off. But sthira sukha asana basically means that you want your seat to be a balance of strength and ease. If I'm going to extrapolate even further, you want strength without rigidity and flexibility without instability. That's the aim, right? So if you take that back to your question, we want within the shoulder joint, every joint, you want to find that balance between that strength and that ease, that strength and that suppleness, right? And it's that dance that we play, right? I went to one of my gurus in Bali, and he looked at me and looked at my body, and he's looked at me and goes, normal asana. I'm like, I go, why? He goes, look. And he's right. Like, I probably need to work on the more subtle energies of the practice, right? So he looked at my shoulders, looked at my upper body. Not like I'm a bodybuilder, but he just looked at me and he's like, you don't need to practice asana. So, of course, again, I don't have that balance. I have probably a little bit too much strength and not enough flexibility. So you want that balance of strength and ease. So a lot of people who struggle with shoulder instability, a lot of the time have over flexible and over mobile joints. So a good antidote to that is longer holds.
Yes, that's what we're talking. That was the question. If anyone lost
We got there. We can bang on about sutras if you want.
How do you strengthen the shoulders?
Longer holds. That's a really simple answer that I could have said 5 minutes ago. I do apologize. Yeah, longer holds and then strengthen your end range. So if we're using the push-up example, which we would use the push-up, if a yoga teacher is rushing through a class and you feel you need to hold something for longer, just do it. Especially if you're hypermobile and you need to strengthen the end range, just hold the high push-up position. Hold it. Don't move any further because that's the end range in that plane, and you need to build up strength in that range. And that way you build up strength in multiple ranges. So longer holds is definitely one of many ways.
And that is what, I guess, one of the amazing things about yoga as a modality, a movement modality, is the balance between strength and flexibility, right? Like,
that's it.
That's huge because you don't see that in every modality. A lot are just one or the other.
No. But it's also quite contradiction. I've talked to yoga teachers about this. Sometimes you've got the yin type. We won't talk about Ayurveda, but if you know Ayurveda, you've got the doshas. But anyway, you've got those kapha heavy, so the people with those heavier energies sort of get drawn to yin. And you got the pitta, the vatas who want vinyasa, chaturanga, but yet sometimes the opposite is sometimes needed. I'm a bit of a bolster hugging yin lover. And maybe when I do have the time, I have a kid and that they ruin your yoga life. But anyway, practice. But anyway, I love my kid. He's not watching this. He's not watching this. He's not watching this. He's not. He doesn't have the attention span for it. I wonder where he gets that from. So, yeah, I think it's important to know which one you gravitate towards, and maybe that's at the compromise of the other one. Yeah.
100%. So, it's a dangerous question, but anything else you'd like to add?
Don't be afraid to talk to your teacher before.
Yes.
I think that's really, really important. None of us are doctors. Well, maybe we do. I don't know all the teachers. Maybe there are. But there are definitely some physiotherapists and people that are obviously quite educated in this area. Talk to your teacher before. Say, hey, I've just given birth 6 weeks ago. Hey, I've just had a recurrent shoulder dislocation. Just talk to the teacher before they're aware. That way they can keep an eye on it. Also, choose the class that's right for you. You know, if you just gave birth 6 weeks ago and you haven't done a lot of yoga for a long period of time, probably not a very strong vinyasa would probably be beneficial. Even if you're given clearance from a doctor, doctors don't actually know a lot about exercise or the body. It's another discussion, but there are holes in their acumen and they don't know a lot about it. Even if you've been cleared by the doctor, talk to your yoga instructor before. And please come to one of my classes. I normally get the people after me going, Ian, here's my MRI here. Ian, I get all the MRIs after class. People want to know more about their bodies and how they can sort of adjust. And listen to your body. I know we said it at the start. It's so important. If you feel that you're not feeling right, and it could be emotional, it could be metaphysical, it could be, emotional blockages, it could be the amount of sleep you've had last night, it could be your diet, it could be a multitude, not only physical. Just when you get to your practice, just listen to where your body's at. And if you feel your yoga instructor's got straight into the class and you haven't had that moment, just do it. I love when students ignore what I'm saying and do whatever they want to do, because I'm like, they're actually doing what they need to do. So I think if there's a take-home message at the start of your class, do what you never do, whether it be pranayama, meditation, but that first few moments of the class, just check in. How am I feeling emotionally? How am I feeling physiologically? How am I feeling energetically? And just start to take note. And that's like a gauge of what your next 60 minutes is going to look like. And I think that people just don't do that. The ego's like, I'm going to get my chaturanga and you're like, you've been sitting at a desk. Maybe you need to just be in child's pose for about 5 minutes, 10 minutes. That's okay. Yeah. So just, again, it's that beautiful little dialogue you've got. I know I'm talking about the sutra, but one of the sutras I like is Ishvara Pranidhanaha, which is the surrendering to what is and surrendering to what you can't change, right? And I think that's such a beautiful way to start the class. Just surrender. You know what? This is where I'm at. And that's okay, right? So I think that's my take-home message.
Yoga is really a practice of surrender, right? I'm peeling the layers on the yoga mat. I'm not sure if you've heard this saying, but I really love it. And it's the most advanced person in the room is the person doing Shavasana for the whole class.
Absolutely.
It's because it's the only person listening to their body.
100%. Yeah, it is. It's so important. And we don't, in our Western society of distraction, we literally have the opposite focus. It's like the spotlight is out and the spotlight is never in. And when we're being asked for the spotlight to go in, we're not, where's the nearest distraction, right? We'd pour concrete on it, right? And it's a practice of mine that I like to think I've got better at, but you know what? If child's pose is calling you, I feel like I need to meditate more. So I spend 10 minutes in meditation. I don't actually listen to what the teacher's saying. Sorry if I go to a class, I'm not doing what you're saying, but I just my mind needs to be calmer, as you can see from this last 20, 30 minutes. But anyway, yes, that's my take-home message.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I hope that everybody has laughed as much as I have in this episode, because it is good for the soul. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Thanks.